This episode is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. You can find all the lore, including the short story at the center of this video, on the Magic the Gathering website by following this link. This video contains major plot points for The Blessing of Blood, so if you'd like to read it spoiler-free, you can do that and then come back here. By the time we meet Odric in the short story The Blessing of Blood by Marcus Terrell Smith, the master tactician and devout follower of the Church of Avacyn has already experienced his own moment of Hamartia. Described in Aristotle's Poetics as an error of judgment, Hamartia is an essential ingredient in the formation of the tragic hero. It is the pivotal mistake that changes the trajectory of the character's fate and commences their downfall. Sometimes Hamartia is revealed through the mechanism of dramatic irony, a structural device that gives the audience more knowledge than the characters have themselves, leading us to suffer their mistakes far before they do. I think of The Titanic, a story with many layers of dramatic irony, the most significant of which is the title itself. How differently that film watches if we aren't already aware of the historic events that inspired it, if we don't know from the very beginning that the ship will sink. Returning to Aristotle's understanding of tragedy, the crash into the wayward iceberg marks the climax of the story, the exact moment of fortune's reversal. It is in this terrific moment following the highest point of the tragic arc that we find Odric in The Blessing of Blood, who is full of regret that grips him like a vice as he gently weeps in the dark. The small chapel in which he prays is not a grandiose and spacious Gothic cathedral decorated with stained glass and sophisticated altars adorned in gold. Rather, it is a small, humble chapel in the town of Nearheath, outside the walls of the human city of Thraben, probably similar in size and scale as this church in Grossfeil, Germany. In a modest space like this, voices reverberate off the walls, and the darkness sits thick in the absence of candlelight and tall windows. Odric has been here for weeks, praying, lamenting his Hamartia, his horrible lapse in judgment. But this behavior is so unlike that of the self-assured strategist we met nearly 10 years ago. Introduced in Jenna Helen's story that shares the name of his first card, Odric was once a valiant and intrepid hero driven by his commitment to justice and empowered by his resolute faith. At the beginning of this story, he is described with title after title: Sir Odric, Master Tactician, Commander of the Gavany Riders, Recipient of the Moonsilver Accommodation. These accolades frame Odric as a hero but also mark one by one his eventual failures. Each one foreshadows a different downfall. If the tragic hero's ruination is to carry any dramatic weight, well, there must be something worth losing. Soon after his introduction, Odric and his entrusted lieutenant Greta are dispatched to Torbach to discuss a rise in Wolfir presence with the town's mayor. With this conversation, we learn that Odric's son was killed by werewolves. This is another key element to the formation of the tragic hero. Not only does this detail give motivation to Odric's behavior, but it invites readers to sympathize with his loss. Odric is not a stock character, a one-dimensional storybook hero. Instead, his gallantry is tinted with grief, which gives him depth and again sets him up for his ensuing Hamartia. After conversing with the mayor, Odric and Greta begin their hunt. The pieces are set into motion. 4 years later, in 2016, we are reunited with Odric in the short story The Lunarch Inquisition by James Wyatt. As Avacyn's madness takes over all of Innistrad, Thalia writes to Thraben and warns Odric of the spreading corruption in the church. She delivers horrifying news that inquisitors are executing children in the name of Avacyn, and encourages Odric to take command of the Lunarch Council and put an end to the purge. But Odric refutes her warning and blindly sides with his faith. Like Frodo dismissing Sam before hobbling into Shelob's lair, Odric undermines Thalia's judgment with a cutting remark. "I serve Avacyn and her church, and so do you, in case you've forgotten, Guardian of Thraben." Odric then calls upon Greta to escort Thalia beyond the outer wall, committing a total betrayal of her trust. Here, Odric disappoints us, but it's because we care about him that his treatment of Thalia stings so bad. Returning to Aristotle, the ideal tragic hero cannot be a man of pure virtue, otherwise his downfall would only invoke in us disgust and contempt. Conversely, he must also not be wicked, or his misfortune would be satisfying, like the villain who receives their just deserts. Rather, he must be good in heart but possess a minor yet significant flaw that will lead him to err. Odric's devotion to the church and his disregard for Thalia's heed, despite her overwhelming evidence, angers us. Since he has been established as an honorable man, we feel conflicted when he does not listen to his closest friend. It is only when the Bishop Jaron denounces Thalia, labeling her a heretic and sentencing her to execution, that Odric starts to see the truth. As his best friend is imprisoned, Odric suffers a tremendous inner schism brought on by his blunder. Thalia was right. The priests in the Lunarch Council are assembling to summon the profane prince Ormondal. Odric recognizes the error in his judgment, which defines his pivotal moment of Hamartia. I think of that beautiful REM song. Its melancholic lyrics swirl around in my head as our hero begins to lose his religion. This rupture with his church is made manifest soon after he realizes his fatal mistake. As he breaks Thalia out of the chapel jail, he must slay one by one a series of Cathars he once helped train. Swiftly, yet full of remorse, he cleaves his sword hilted with the symbol of the church he once loved through the armor and flesh of the guards who continued to defend it. In the stables of the cathedral, Odric murders his pupils and ascends to the climax of the Aristotelian tragedy. In this portrait by Chase Stone, we find our tragic hero coming to terms with his hamartia. This painting invites compassion. We know the weight of regret, of dealing with the mistakes of our ways. We can see in Odric's grieving eyes a symbol changing shape before him, his truths dissolving as his spirit breaks in half. We know this pain, cold and poignant. Unable to move on with Thalia and Greta, Odric resigns himself to a small chapel in Nearheath. He is alone and destitute. So opens the short story The Blessing of Blood in Crimson Vow. In the dark chapel, Odric is battling with his faith and further losing his religion. Upon hearing the news of Avacyn's death, Odric lashes out and destroys the holy relics and artifacts that decorate the nave. He completely annihilates the altar. His despair turns into unmitigated rage as he finally rejects his church in full. The crashing sounds of a collapsing faith echo off the damp walls. In this moment, at his lowest point, there arrives a dark mist that creeps through the chapel doors. The pieces have taken position across the board, but soon they must be captured. The arrival of the vampire Henrika initiates the falling action and propels us towards Odric's tragic conclusion. With the help of a group of possessed priests and Cathars, the vampire seer attacks Odric and begins a ritual to summon the demon Ormondal. Slowly, swarms of vampires from the inferior Domnathi bloodline populate the chapel and begin to overwhelm Odric's resistance efforts. Then, suddenly, hello, old friend. Thalia arrives, granting in Odric the chance to finally redeem himself for all the horrors he had allowed to pass in his time at Thraben. With acrobatic prowess and a heart full of newfound warmth, Odric and Thalia begin to rip through the ranks of Domnathi invaders. Together they weave in and out of the pews of the chapel, both synchronized in a blade dance of carnage. But soon, they are overrun, and the skirmish comes to a terrifying dramatic halt. The air stands still. The chapel falls deathly quiet. Henrika takes full command and initiates the demonic ritual, cutting the throats of an innocent commoner and threatening the sacrifice of Thalia herself. In an instant, she grabs Thalia's sword and swings it downward upon the guardian of Thraben, offering a devastating blow. Aimed to sever Thalia's hands, the blade instead cuts across the chest of Odric, who has just leapt between the two to sacrifice himself to the strike. Only moments before was Odric tracing the prayer of Avacyn across his chest. Now that chest is split open with a mortal wound. Blood pours across the chapel floor, tempting all the ravenous vampires who just bore witness to the slaughter. But instead of letting Odric die, Henrika bites into his neck and infects him with the vampiric curse. Suddenly, Odric is reborn and revolting against the one who formed him. He is charging through the air, eyes glowing the color of 2 crimson suns, fangs flashing, and the sword of Avacyn glowing brighter than ever before. With his transformation now complete, Henrika vanishes from the chapel in fear and leaves the 2 heroes alone to reconcile with their new reality. Odric's conversion completes the tragic hero's downfall. In sacrificing himself to save Thalia and losing his humanity to corrupt blood, he becomes the monster he fears. And fear is fundamental to tragedy. Without fear, the audience never sympathizes with the hero to the extent that makes the story so visceral. As Charles H. Reeves writes, I should like to invite attention to another phrase which may also be regarded as describing the tragic hero. Fear, we are told, is occasioned by the misfortune of one like ourselves. Therefore, if the drama is to invoke fear in us, it must place before us the misfortunes of a man like ourselves. Of course, we don't relate to Odric at the superficial level of the plot events. We aren't worried about becoming a vampire. What we do fear, however, is losing the core of ourselves to a force beyond our control. We fear betraying our closest allies and losing their love to hubris. We fear the metaphorical monster, and we fear the imprisonment of becoming that which it represents. This is the tragedy of Odric's character, and the reasons for which he remains heroic and admirable. At the end of the Blessing of Blood, Thalia asks Odric if he can still see the moon. On Innistrad, the moon is a harbinger of evil, but its vampires cannot bear to cross running water that reflects its light. The moon is also central to Thalia and Odric's prayers. Across all these short stories, both characters often repeat the phrase, I serve the soft light of the moon that holds back the terrors of the night. Thalia's question, thus, is inquiring about Odric's humanity. She wants to know if Odric, the man, is completely gone. But when Odric looks through the broken roof of the chapel and glares at the moonlight above, he is not in pain. He does not experience the sorrow or regret that had haunted him for weeks prior. Instead, he is awash with a sense of total peace. This concludes the arc of the tragic hero and opens the audience to a profound moment of catharsis, the release of repressed emotion, the final pillar in Aristotle's tragic plot structure. Odric's acceptance of his fate is also, in turn, what renders him still a hero. Importantly, despite his new condition as a vampire, he does not possess any hint of villainy. By the story's conclusion, it is assumed that Odric and Thalia will be reunited once more to fight the terrors of the night. The portrait of Odric, blood-cursed by Chris Rallis, also radiates with heroism and tempered fury, suggesting he will still fight for the humans of Innistrad. I found this quote in a guide on literary criticism that says it best. By the end of the play, the tragic hero comes to recognize his or her own error and to accept its tragic consequences. The real hero does not curse fate or the gods. The real hero is humbled and enlightened by the tragedy. And this is exactly Odric's emotional state in the finale of The Blessing of Blood. Returning to Marcus Terrell Smith's beautiful passage that ends this story, slowly he made his way across the blood-laden sanctuary and pried his sword from the bowl of the pool. It flashed angelically in the moonlight, as if still blessed by some higher power. The blade, turned flat in front of him, held his reflection. In it he saw his blackened vampiric eyes, but found no monster staring back at him, no woeful abomination. He simply saw himself as a younger man, a Cathar full of great ideals and morals, a champion of a man, a righteous protector of the soft light. Special thanks to Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring this video. I've admired Odric since his appearance as the front-facing card of the mono-white M13 intro deck all those years ago, so revisiting his story here was a natural fit for me. I encourage you to read these side stories, especially The Blessing of Blood by Marcus Terrell Smith. They are lovely pieces of fiction, and if you're anything like me, you immerse yourself in side quests before following the main plot anyway. An ongoing thank you to all my patrons here. If you'd like to see your name alongside theirs in the credits and support me directly, head to patreon.com/Rhystic Studies and pitch in. Finally, let me know what you think of Odric's transformation into a vampire in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.